Hey, thanks for stopping by Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. Make sure you're subscribed and you're checking out the bell icon down there so that you're getting notifications on my content. Like, comment, and share. That's all I ask. So, today is another episode of Understanding Alinsky. And what are we going to talk about in this episode? Well, we're going to delve into, and this is probably going to be a briefer conversation because it can be a little bit harder for people to wrap their minds around. But we're going to talk a little bit about rule number 9, and Alinsky's rule number 9 was the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. And the reason that Alinsky formulated this rule was because at the time, one of the things that he was really working on in his community organization was holding, should we say, corporations and others to a Marxist, leftist standard of performance. And to some degree, what this tied into was one of the rules which we already talked about, which was the isolation of your opponent. And they really focus in that one on going after individuals, right? Making sure that individuals cut off from support, cut off from friends, allies, whatever you want to call it. However, they also wanted to isolate corporations, organizations, things like that, hold them to the same kind of Marxist leftist standard that they were going to hold individuals to. So first they go after individuals and make enemies of the individual. They cut them off from their support. They get rid of them. They isolate them so that they either cave into what's being asked of them or they're relegated to obscurity. And for the organizations or corporations or whatever, or a community or a local government entity, they bring that same kind of fear in on how they establish illegitimate tactics. And what they would do is they would threaten action, right? They would say, we're going to do something if you don't do this. And so in one case, I think I might have mentioned this before, they threatened us a piss in. There was no other way to call it, no other thing to call it, but they threatened a piss in. They were going to have, in the Chicago O'Hare Airport, they were going to have well-dressed black men go in and occupy every one of the men's bathrooms and urinals so that there was no place for any of the travelers to go, therefore forcing people to not be able to pee and be completely discomforted as they were traveling in and out of Chicago O'Hare. You're like, okay, well, that sounds stupid. Well, but see, the thing is, it was a threat that carried some weight because he could have organized it if he wanted to, and yet he ended up not having to do it because the community backed down and gave in to his demand. So in this rule number 9, the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. What we see now is this tactic is now used by the left on a daily basis. Black Lives Matter, in particular, the Marxist leftist terrorist organization of Black Lives Matter. And once again, Black Lives Matter because, well, they're made in the image of God, just like you and I. And so their lives matter, my life matters, and every life matters. But Black Lives Matter, even the name itself is a tool, but one of their tactics is to threaten action. Jesse Jackson, when he formed the Rainbow Coalition, he did the same thing. He would threaten action. And we see this a lot in the apology tour aspect of wokeism as it's going on today. Oh, well, we found like 42 years ago, this actor said this thing and then he shouldn't have said it. And it's culturally insensitive and it's cultural appropriation or whatever the case might be. So now we're going to threaten action. And so this person goes on because he doesn't want to, especially in the case of people in Hollywood and the recording industry and other, elite media types, they get threatened with losing jobs, of being, put in certain roles and whatnot. And so they go on the apology tour. No action's been taken, but the threat is there. But what else are we seeing now today? We're starting to see this play out in the corporate world now, where instead of corporations being held hostage by Black Lives Matter and Antifa and others, and there again, leftist Marxist terrorist organizations, we are now seeing that they are implementing this within the public sphere and within private corporations. So there again, I mentioned an individual who worked for a very large metro public sector. This person worked for 28 some years, or has been employed for 28 some years, 20 some years, by in the public sector, working for a government entity, and was placed out on administrative leave without any contact for a long time. And the threat was, something's going to happen to you. Well, no dictate on what was going to happen, no communication. It was just something's going to happen. Private. Well, let me finish that thought. This individual is like, I don't know what's going on. See, that's unsettling because your mind races. Like, what's happening here? And that's a tactic. It's a tactic that was taught by Alinsky. And many people in leadership, especially in the government sector, in public sector now, whether they be people in elected servants position or appointed servants positions, they have learned these tactics. Sometimes they don't even know they've learned it. Some of them know that they have learned it. And so they use it effectively. They like the idea of keeping people off kilter, which also ties into one of the things we've talked about already, which is once your opponent, your enemy, gets used to dealing with one thing, you hit them from the side with another. You keep them off kilter. So here are these threats. In the public sector isn't just using it now. The private sector is using it. I talked to an individual the other day, happens to work for a major corporation here in the United States, and they're now going to require that all of their staff be vaccinated for the COOF, that they get the COOF jab. And if they don't get the COOF jab, they have to wear their masks. They have to wear facial coverings if they don't get the COOF jab. And they have to sign a statement saying that they've had the COOF jab, and turn that in, or sign a statement saying they haven't had it. And then they'll be randomly audited for the veracity of their statement. And if they're found out to not have been telling the truth, they could be disciplined up to termination from this private corporation. So let's explore that, okay? This friend works for a private corporation, and there again, to some degree, private corporations do have certain employment freedoms. I wish we could see this applied across the board so that Christian businesses weren't forced to hire people that completely disagree with them, and weren't forced to fund or pay for things that go against their values. But, the left is the left. They don't have equal standards. But so here's my friend working for this corporation. He's told, you cannot work without a mask if you're not jabbed for the COOF. And we're going to make you sign this statement saying you have been jabbed or you haven't been jabbed. And if we find out that you lied and you don't wear, or that you're not wearing a mask, and then we audit you, you're going to lose your job. That's a threat. But what it is you don't know if you're going to get audited. You don't know if you're one of those people that's going to get audited. So now, am I advocating that people lie? You know, I think that a private corporation is going to have a really hard time enforcing that, making a person prove something about their private medical treatment and history. I think that's going to be very, very difficult. I think public sector is going to have a harder time with it even still. But I think the private sector is going to have a very hard time with it, because that's a demand. Like, you will give us this proof. I don't have to give you that proof. Are you jabbed for the coof? Yep. Prove it. Don't want to. Well, then we're going to fire you. On what grounds? You won't prove it. Show me where I have to. I'm not a lawyer, okay? I only play one on my YouTube channel, as the old commercial. I'm not a dentist. I only play one on TV. My point being is that it's the threat of termination that's hanging over your head. And when is it going to come, if it's going to come? And they like that tool because what it does, especially, so now they learned it because they had it used against them. People like groups that Alinsky organized, people like Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, people like the Al Sharptons of the world. And what's that big wig attorney now that runs around and jumps on every single law enforcement involved shooting? Crum, Ben Crum. They use the threat of action. They use the threat of action. Like, if you don't do what we want, we're going to take action. Maxine Waters shows up in Minneapolis on the eve of the Derek Chauvin verdicts and says, if you don't convict, this should be done. It's a tactic. The threat is there. And once the threat is there, whether it's verbalized or insinuated, or it's an amorphous situation where you don't know for sure what's happening, your mind begins to race. Pressure begins to build. You begin to get anxiety and wonder what's going to happen to me, and like, what happens to this? What happens to that? I've had several conversations with people now in the last couple of months, actually since January, really, but it's really been rolling, like just like a snowball rolling down a hill in a cartoon. It's just a snowball is just gathering all the steam as it goes, and the faster it goes, it's picking up more and more and more. And so this is happening. Government entities, public sectors, private sector, they've learned this tactic because it's been used on them, and now they're using it on the individual. So not only are they isolating the individuals, but now they're also having these vague amorphous threats that are hanging over the individual, and the individual has no idea what's coming, and they count on that to weaken the resolve. It causes demoralization, and it poisons the mind, and they use it. And they love it. It's a phenomenal tool in the hands of the Alinskyites. And sadly, most people in leadership in private organizations and in the private sector and the public sector are Alinskyites. Some willingly, some unknowingly, and some haphazardly. But they're Alinskyites. They've learned these tactics. It's part of the bullying system. And it's devastating to individuals, and it can even be devastating to smaller organizations in the private sector, and it can be devastating to small public sector groups. Think really small towns where something happens and they threaten they're going to come in and they're going to raise hell. So it's the threat, and it's always there. So think about this, like your parents when you were young, and they would, for those of you that had, parents that actually disciplined you, and they would say, well, if you don't do this, then something's going to happen. And you were like, whew. Like in my situation, I brought a lot of this stuff on myself. So like my mom would ask me to do something and I would completely forget to do it. Mostly because I'd blow it off and then I'd blow it off and then I'd forget. And my mom would be like, well, did you do what I asked you to do? And I'd be like, I don't even remember what you asked me to do. Well, and to her credit, she didn't like freak out on me or anything, but she's like, okay, well, until you can remember what I asked you to do, you can go to your room and think about it. And so what would happen to TC? TC would go to his room because he was told to go to his room. And it's not like going to your room today. Like today you get sent to your room and you got like your phone, you got your computer, and you got your laptop, and you've got your video games and all that stuff. Like in my day, back in the day, I went to my room and like all there was my books. Well, I'd be so worried about what it was that I forgot to do that I couldn't even concentrate on reading. So I'd just lay there on my bed trying to remember what it was that I was told to do that I didn't do, that I blew off intentionally. And now I'm getting, in trouble for, ostensibly. No idea what it was. Is it now, there again, my mom's not an Alinsky, but I'm using that example of how our brains work. So the more I thought about it, the worse the outcome got in my mind. And that's what they count on today. That is absolutely what the people who use these tactics, the threat is more terrifying than the thing itself. The threat of losing your job is terrible because it's an unknown. But ultimately, for a lot of people, is like if you lose your job, like you just get a different one. There's a tactic used by a lot of corporations and even the public sector where what they'll do is they'll say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you for your resignation. We don't want to terminate you, but if you make us terminate you, we'll ruin you. I mean, I've talked to people who have had that said to them by public and private sector employers, by public and private sector executives, if you will. If we're going to ask you to resign, and we will not hinder you leaving, and we will not hinder, your job placement going forward. But if you make us terminate you, if you make us fire you, we'll ruin you, is the implication. And then the person's given time to think about it. Well, it's the threat, right? It's the threat. And it's warfare, people. It is. It's cultural warfare, and it's being used very, very well right now by the leftists and the Marxists out there. And we need to be aware that it's a tactic. We need to be aware that it's well implemented, and we need to be aware that it's a well-oiled machine, and they love it. They love to get your mind racing. So those people out there who have been told by Antifa, so I just interacted with somebody on Twitter the other day and like, well, I just got this from, somebody, and they are claiming that they can research me and find me. Should I be worried? Well, 1, yes, be worried. 2, that's what they want. They want you to be worried. 3, it's probably an empty threat, but it could be legit. Where's the mind go? So when you run into these situations where you run into this Alinskyite tactic from this rules of radicals of the threat being worse than the thing itself, prepare yourself. It's going to hit you. You're going to go, ugh, this is going to suck. And then you're going to go, ugh, how am I going to recover from this? But you process it, get through it, work through it, work past it, get into it, dig down into it, and really start to ask yourself, is this as bad as it feels? Because that's what they're counting on you doing. They're just counting on you wallowing and dwelling on the reality or the potentiality, excuse me, of what could happen and how bad it's going to be. Well, what if that? And then what about this? And what if, and what about, and then this, and what if that happens? And then if that happens, what if this happens? And then what if I lose this? And then like think about the person who's a paycheck to paycheck kind of person. And that's normal, everybody, you should have this much in savings, and we should be, work. Not that the American dollar is going to be worth much anymore, but then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, I'm going to lose my house in a matter of a few months. I'm going to lose my vehicle, and I'm going to lose everything I've ever worked for. That kind of stuff. When you catch your mind racing towards that, realize that's their tactic. When Antifa threatens to find you and expose you, I have an acquaintance been told, we're going to find you. I have another acquaintance. We're going to burn your house down. These are their tactics. It's the threat. Now, granted, if they actually burn your house down, that's the reality of them actually working out the threat, and the reality is worse than the threat. But what does that do to you? They want you to back off. They want you to stop. Whatever your perceived cultural, societal offense is, they want you to stop. And once they get you in a position of capitulation, you're never going to stop. These people who have done these apology tours, they'll never be free again, because everything they say can be used against them. Oh, what did you mean by this? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything. Well, it sounds like you meant something. Well, I didn't mean anything, but I'm sorry. Well, what about this? I'm sorry. It's the never-ending apology tour. And once you sign on for it, it's over. So here's the thing. As bad as the threat might feel, as bad as you might perceive the threat to be, don't give ground. Don't back off. Because if you demonstrate that you're willing to back off, they'll keep ramping up the threats until they ultimately have victory. And that's their goal. And that's why they do it. Because, like the rule that says, isolate your opponent and make sure that they have no support. Because individuals hurt easier than organizations. The organizations that are using this now, and individuals that are using it on individuals, the organizations that are using this, private and public sector, terrorist groups like Black Lives Matter, and Marxist terrorist groups, Antifa, and all those others, they're counting on the threat being enough to get what they want out of you. And they'll keep ramping up the threats. And eventually, they're either going to back off and realize you're not going to cave in, or they're going to have to take action. And then once they take action, there's resolution. Or they back off and there's resolution. But don't back down out of fear. Don't let the fear of what could be. Don't let the fear of the terminus of the threat or the event. Don't let the fear of it overwhelm you to the point that you're paralyzed in your decision making. Because that's what Alinsky wanted, and that's what he taught his disciples, and that's what his disciples have taught their disciples. These acolytes of Marxism count on people being afraid of the consequences for being societal sinners. Don't let them win. Be prepared. So until next time, Sic Semper Tyrannis.